Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on epistemics and evidentials. I'm JC Walmsley from Indiana University. I'll be the chair for the session. And our first talk will be from Nancy Caplow on a unified account of the epistemic-evidential system of Tibetan.
Okay. Thank you, JC. I just want to check one thing. Do I need to periodically upload my document if people come in through the waiting room? Well, anyway, I'll share my screen, so that should be okay.
I'll download it and then I can share it periodically.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to present a unified model of the epistemic evidential system of Tibetan. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. Okay, why is this interesting? Well, Tibetan has one of the most rich and complex systems of epistemic and evidential markers observed in the languages of the world. Eichenwald and Lapola, 2007, note that by far the most complex systems of evidentiality are found in the Tibeto-Burman domain and also in numerous families in the Americas. So understanding such a complex system could offer new perspectives on epistemic and evidential systems in other languages. Well, how complex is the Tibetan system? Well, diasporic Common Tibetan, which is the variety that I describe here as an illustration of the language at large, has at least 20 distinct markers. Lhasa, or spoken standard Tibetan, and some other varieties have even more, and some varieties of the language have fewer. These markers fall into 8 categories, or terms, as Eichenwald calls them. And Eichenwald considers systems of 5 or more terms to be comparatively large and uncommon, with few clear descriptions available. So 5 or more is rare, and this is 8. So having a clear description of a complex system is, this complex is a nice contribution. Previous researchers have described different parts of this system, but there have been few attempts to synthesize the contrasts and cross-cutting relationships between the various categories in the system as a whole. So what's new in my approach? First, I examine the entire system of the Tibetan markers rather than focusing on just one half or the other. And I claim that every marker in the system indexes both evidential and epistemic information. That's crucial. So, some details on the varieties of Tibetan I refer to here. Diasporic Common Tibetan, DCT, is a variety of standard spoken Tibetan. It's typical of what you might hear in Dharamsala, Kathmandu, or other emigre communities. And I also refer to Lhasa. There's also some examples from Lhasa and standard spoken Tibetan, Lhasa SST. And I use this term to conflate Lhasa Tibetan, standard spoken Tibetan, or central Tibetan, because definitions in some of the early work on Tibetan didn't really distinguish these. And sometimes I use the term Tibetic, which Tornata 2014 proposed as a term to capture the language distinctions, language level distinctions between the varieties of Tibetan. Sometimes I use Tibetan and Tibetic alternately, so I just want to give you a heads up on that. In terms of the methodology, limitations and corroboration, this project originated long ago in a linguistics field methods class at UCSB. The data comes from elicitation and monologic narrative. There's no interactive discourse data. My language consultant, we worked with a single speaker, and I met with him regularly for about 1.5 years. So that sounds like there are some significant limitations or potential limitations, but in fact, the analysis of the individual markers here is corroborated in the sense that the form and function of the markers in diasporic Common Tibetan that I describe are similar to the form and function of markers described for other varieties of the language. So here are the definitions I used here. These are pretty standard. Evidentials have to do with evidence, the existence of evidence, and the type of evidence. So both existence and type are relevant. Others also refer to the speaker's access to evidence or knowledge, for example, Tornata and Lapola, 2014. I see evidentials as answering a discourse question. Well, how do you know? And epistemics have to do with certainty, the degree of certainty or the level of certainty. And I see epistemics as answering the question, are you really sure about that? Note that these terms have to do with the speaker, her experience, what's going on in her mind, and how she presents a proposition. Another term I use is confidence. This is something I introduce here, the level of confidence with which the listener is advised to regard the proposition. This advice is reflected by the speaker's choice of epistemic evidential marker. And note that this term has to do with a listener. So my perspective in this analysis is more interactional rather than cognitive, because the speaker is actually trying to impart an attitude in the mind of the listener, a level of confidence. So I talked about how complex the system is. Let me talk now about how complex the individual markers are. These are main clause final epistemic evidential linking verbs and auxiliaries. So as linking verbs, they can occur with predicate nominals and also existential, locative, possessive, and attributive clauses, and auxiliaries, they occur with lexical verbs. They're densely packed with syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic information. They index tense, aspect, volitionality, and person, or they contribute to those features. And they provide information regarding certainty, evidentiality, degree of engagement, and level of confidence, which is one of my new contributions here, level of confidence. So epistemic and evidential and epistemic coding. I claim that every marker in the system indexes both evidential and epistemic information. This is completely new. And this makes possible a completely different type of analysis. I can code every marker in the system in terms of two binary indexical parameters: whether the speaker has evidence for what she's asserting, that is plus or minus evidence, and whether the speaker is certain about what she's asserting, that is plus or minus certainty. So this gives us the following logically possible combinations, sets A, B, and C. So set A, the speaker has evidence of what she's asserting, and she is certain about it. This is what she's telling her listener. When she chooses a marker from set B, she's telling her listener, I have evidence for what I'm asserting, but I'm not certain about it actually. And when she chooses a marker from set C, she's telling her listener, I don't have any evidence and I'm not really sure about this either. So let's think about what categories, let's look next at what categories these correspond to. These correspond to what I call three discrete levels of confidence. So A are the markers of certainty. These are markers for which the speaker has evidence and she says, I'm certain about this. Set B are markers of inference. So the speaker is telling the listener, I have evidence for what I'm saying, but I'm not really sure about it. And set C are the non-evidential markers where the speaker tells the listener, I don't have any evidence and I'm not sure. So those are pure speculation. This choice of epistemic evidential marker advises the listener about the degree of confidence with which he may regard the speaker's proposition. So now let's go on and see, what does this get us? What does the system of 20 epistemic evidential markers in diasporic common Tibetan look like when we look at it in terms of these three categories? And I should say that actually the categories came after the analysis. I didn't come up with the idea of these binary indexical parameters first and then try to cram my data into it. This is the product of wrestling with the data for a good number of years. We can see here that category A are the markers of certainty, and these include direct evidentials, which means that the speaker has her own evidence for the claim that she's asserting. And we have both perceptual markers, duk and song, and personal markers, yin, ye, and chung. And the markers of certainty also include indirect evidentials where the speaker doesn't have firsthand knowledge. These include factual evidentials like re and yore, and the reported speech marker, which conveys a high degree of authority, I should say, sa. So that's category A. Now note that category B and category A both belong to the category of evidentials. That's here, B and A are both plus evidence. So these are both evidentials. So the markers of inference, we have markers of inference that match the markers of certainty. The two markers yin saduk and yu saduk, when they occur at the end of a clause, they tell the listener that the speaker is making an inference based on perceptual evidence. Yin sa yu and yu sa yu tell the listener that the speaker is making an inference based on personal evidence. And with the with yin sare and yu sare, the speaker is making an inference based on factual evidence. That means that either, well, I'll talk about this a little bit more, either the speaker doesn't have personal evidence or the speaker is choosing not to highlight it. And then finally, we can see that B and C are both markers of non-certainty. So looking back here, we can see that they are both minus certainty. So the non-evidential markers, the columns on the left over here, direct evidentials and indirect evidentials, these only apply to the evidentials. They don't apply to the non-evidentials. And we have markers of guessing, yindo, yudo, I guess, yinkide, I think, and yupada, it seems, yimpada, yupada, it seems. So now I'll go through and I'll give you some examples of some of the markers of certainty. Here's some markers, examples illustrating, oh, sorry, my numbers got messed up here. The current perception marker, tate chempoduk, the horse is big. So I glossed duk, that's the marker of current perception, that's what CP stands for. And so it has both this epistemic evidential information, and then again, it has syntactic information. So ELPA stands for existential, locative, possessive, attributive. And this is used as a linking verb with those kinds of predicates. So this is an attributive predicate. In the next example here, he's writing a letter, ko yige tigiduk, sorry, ko yige tigiduk. This speaker has current perceptual evidence. He's writing a letter. I'm sure about this, and I know because I see it right now. And here I code this with a comma, and then I indicate the syntactic function. It's functioning as an auxiliary verb with a lexical verb predicate. Here's an example of past perception from the pair story. A young boy came riding a bike. So this is the speakers describing what he saw in the film. Song is a marker of past perception in terms of the semantic pragmatic meaning, and it's functioning as an auxiliary verb with a lexical verb predicate in terms of the syntactic meaning. Here's a comparison of some different past tense choices. Ku yige ti chung means he wrote a letter, and I know this because I received the letter. I'm sure about this, and I know because I received the letter. Ku yige ti song, he wrote a letter. I'm sure about this. I have past perceptual evidence. Ku yige ti duk. Now this is an interesting one. He wrote a letter, and I know this not because I have current perceptual evidence of it, but I didn't see him writing. My current perceptual evidence is of the letter itself, and I recognize his handwriting, for example. So what's entailed here is actually inference. But I argued in a paper in 2017, and Nathan Hill also argued that had the same perspective, that although inference is entailed here, it's not the primary information being conveyed by this evidential marker, this epistemic evidential marker. What's mostly conveyed here is that it's a marker of certainty and its current perceptual evidence. And then finally, you could say, Ku yige ti re, he wrote a letter, and I'm just saying it's just a fact. You know, maybe I saw it, maybe I got it, but I'm not bothering to specify, or maybe somebody told me, it doesn't really matter. So the personal evidentials, nye sera pakiye. I'm making hail fall right now, that's with the personal knowledge. We were students when the dog died. This is functioning as a copula. So again, looking back at the whole schematic, now we'll take a quick look at some of the markers of inference. Inference based on current perception here would be appropriate. So the horse is big, tate chempo duk, yore ore. These are markers of certainty. I see the horse, it's general knowledge, general state of affairs, or a simple fact. The horse is big, I'm drawing an inference based on unspecified evidence, inference based on unspecified evidence. Or you could say, tate chempo yusaduk. I'm inferring the horse is big, and I'm basing that inference on observing a very large hoof print or a pile of very large horse droppings. So this is an evidential, but it's also a marker of inference. And then finally, we have an example of the non-evidential markers in the third column. So we've been through each of these. And notice duk, yinsaduk, and yusaduk, inference based on current perception. We have the same markers in each place. So here the speaker has no idea if her addressee's brother has money or not. It's pure speculation. So I guess he has money. So this is no evidence and not certain. So again, this is how the markers all come together. This is where I was 3 years ago with this. So I'm quite pleased to have boiled this down to something that looks so elegant. I was trying to capture the same oppositions here, But until I figured out that I could analyze it in terms of these two binary indexical parameters, nothing came together. So I want to draw a comparison now to the traditional set of evidentials. I want to show you kind of what this buys us. The traditional set of evidential markers, these are observed in Lhasa as standard spoken Tibetan, and these are some of the scholars who observed these. Now remember, I said that even though I worked with only one speaker, the patterns of use that I observe are corroborated, and this is an exact illustration. There's nothing really surprising in these individual markers. What's surprising is that I code them in terms of both plus or minus certainty and plus or minus evidence. And these same markers are observed in a number of other varieties of Tibetan. What's crucial is that I called them markers of certainty, and everybody else has called them evidentials, and this was everybody's favorite topic to study. The direct evidentials, the speaker has firsthand knowledge. Indirect evidentials, the speaker does not claim to have firsthand knowledge. And now here's the traditional set of epistemic markers. So only a few people have really looked at these. These are the markers of speculation. So again, inference based on these are epistemics. Other people said that these indicate degree of certainty. They don't say that these are mark evidentiality. So we have the same markers of inference, and then there are the same markers of what I call non-evidentials, but Lhasa Tibetan also has additional forms. So very few people have actually tried to look at these specifically, and typically what they do is they try to come up with a continuum, identify a continuum of the degree of certainty for these markers. So now what we're doing is I'm looking at them side by side, the evidentials and the epistemics. And so there's a division here. People say these are evidentials, the speaker has evidence, and these are epistemics, they mark degree of certainty. Again, I claim that these also indicate a high degree of certainty, and I claim that some of these also have evidence. So there's a couple things I find unsatisfying about the way previous scholars have looked at it. They make this hard distinction between evidentials and epistemics. Evidentials indicate source of and access to, as some people say, information, and the epistemics indicate degree of certainty. There's no acknowledgement of the markers of inference as conveying evidential information. And this hard distinction is accommodated through semantic extensions, where evidentials can be said to have epistemic extensions, and epistemics can be said to have evidential extensions. But my view is that all of them convey both evidential and epistemic information. Other points I find unsatisfying here are that the analysis of epistemics in terms of degree of certainty. Various scholars have tried to look at these epistemic markers and rate them, rank them in terms of how certain the speaker is. I find this such a subtle semantic task that I would never dare to do it. The other problem is that these analyses exclude the evidentials from this continuum of degree of certainty. These markers are never considered as part of a continuum of degree of certainty. I find that kind of strange. If a marker indicates that the speaker has evidence for and is highly certain about her claim, in my view, that marker should occupy a pole on the continuum. So that's something that I can account for here that hasn't been accounted for before. And the other point that I find unsatisfying is that there's no firm distinction between inference and speculation, right? All of these are lumped together as epistemics. And I think that there's a difference. These have some evidence for them and these do not. So in my view, I regard these as conveying different types of information to the listener. So a final point that I'd like to make, another feature of the system that I capture is that there are two ways of marking inference. Duke, we saw this before, this marker of certainty of current perceptual evidence can be used in a perfect aspect construction. And support for the fact that this is distinct from these morphologically complex yinsaduk, yusaduk, yinsare, yusare, etc., is that Lhasa Tibetan actually has a discrete marker, shak, that's used in the same way. So where in diasporic common Tibetan, you could say, kurisong, you fell and I saw it, or kuriduk, you fell or you have fallen, perfect aspect, but I didn't see you fall. So I see you lying on the ground. So there's a measure of, there's this entailment of inference here. Delancey shows corresponding, or these sentences correspond to Delancey's earlier work, You fell down, Kierang ri song, and Kierang ri shak, which is the perfect or evidential. So he marks this, at that time anyway, he was considering this as a marker of inference. People did well, I don't think anybody actually distinguishes between these two different types of inference, using these duk in diasporic Common Tibetan or shak in Lhasa spoken standard Tibetan versus the morphologically complex marker. In fact, Bettina Zeisler in 2018 says that in Ladakhi you can't actually distinguish them, and I say that you can. So here are some other examples: inference based on perceptual evidence with a lexical verb predicate in the present tense. It's raining, charpa papkiduk, or I could infer it's raining. I see somebody come in with a wet umbrella, charpa papki yusare, but I'm not saying that I'm basing my inference on perceptual evidence. Or I could say charpa papki yusaduk. So here I'm saying that I have current perceptual evidence for it raining. I might see you come in soaking wet. When you look at it in the past tense, you could say charpa papsung, it rained, or charpa pap yinsare. So we can again infer this based on some unspecified evidence. Note this is not current perceptual evidence. It's just saying there's some type of evidence. So when it follows a perfective verb stem, duk in the diasporic variety I studied is equivalent to standard Tibetan shak. And I interpret both of these as markers of deferred perception. Lhasa Tibetan has a specific marker that indicates that the speaker has perceptual evidence of the traces of an event. And shak indicates certainty. It's distinct from the other perceptual markers of certainty, duk and song, and it's also distinct from the other markers of inference which express non-certainty. Oops. So what's new in my findings? I provide a unified analysis of the system as a whole by claiming that every marker in the system indexes both evidence and certainty. I define 3 discrete levels of confidence with which the listener is advised to regard the speaker's proposition. I show that what previous researchers have called epistemic markers can be divided into 2 categories, the markers of inference and the non-evidential markers. And I explain why there are 2 different ways of marking inference. These have been described by others for other varieties of Tibetan, but not accounted for. Thank you. Let me see.
Thank you very much, Nancy.
Sure.
So we now will turn to questions. So if anyone has questions, I'll keep, it looks like Liberty has one. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this presentation. This is really fascinating and very, very cool. I'm wondering whether you get any, whether you get sort of different pragmatic readings if you change the evidential. So I think, so if you were both, you and consultant were both at a horse race and you saw the horse fell, and you'd be expected to use one saying an evidential saying that you saw the horse fell, and you used one that did not, used one that was oh, it's inferential. Does the speaker, would your consultant get a marked reading oh, you don't trust it, or something weird about that?
Those are some of the things that I can't really tell without having more interactional data. But there is, the system can be manipulated to a great extent. The speaker can choose, if they see something, they might not choose to use the marker of perception. They might choose to use the marker of general fact or simple fact. They're just not highlighting that they have perceptual evidence. They can use markers of the personal evidential markers to talk about somebody else in some cases. They can use other markers that are not personal to talk about themselves in other cases. So there's a lot of pragmatic variation here. Just don't have an example of a specific case that you were looking at where you might use a marker of inference where you don't trust where you're seeing, but I would assume that makes sense that you could.
Yeah, just very interested to hear any of the research on sort of pragmatic stuff. The language I worked on, Yongning Na, has both the evidential system and an ecophoricity system, what was used to be referred to as conjunct-disjunct, and they actually interact in some interesting, or kind of link up in certain ways. And then there's also some epistemics, but I don't actually have data on the kind of pragmatic, different pragmatic readings you can get if you choose one evidential or another, or so on. But I'm be really interested in hearing more.
Thank you very much.
Nancy, hi. First of all, brilliant presentation. I've been pulling my hair. I used to have a full head of hair. I've been studying this for 20 years, and this is all I have left. A question and an observation. The question, this sa in Yusare, is that sa, does that have a rendering in written Tibetan, or is that purely spoken?
It does. It's the sa as in earth, the place nominalizer, I think.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
In Lhasa spoken standard Tibetan, it's pa, yupare, yimpare.
Yeah, right, or yore, yeah, right. That's
yes,
what
they use a different nominalizer there, but these are fully lexicalized. They have a characteristic intonation.
Understood, thank you. Also, I just observe, I guess Tibetan will never be a language of American government, because evidently there's no way to show having no evidence but being very certain.
Right. Right.
It really leaves a
always
hole
lie.
in American politics. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Great, thank you, Greg. I think there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I can read it. Thanks for this wonderfully creative analysis. You expressed discomfort, the lumping together of inference and speculation within the set of epistemics. Should one expect other conceptual parameters to shed different new light onto the system, such as a continuum of external versus internal anchoring for utterances? It's conceivable this would cut across both evidentials and epistemic in yet a different way, not that necessarily illuminates much, or would it?
I don't actually know what's meant here by external versus internal anchoring.
Sorry, I just wrote it because I might not be able to say it if I'm speaking. I mean internal to a speaker, as in purely speculation, or external as in there's some form of something outside of the speaker, even though the speaker is obviously also subjectively relating to that.
Well, the speaker is expressing her own degree of certainty. She can always misrepresent herself. I don't know if I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure I know how to answer this, Manuel. The speaker is representing her own kind of stance when choosing a marker of degree of certainty.
Yeah, I just thought perhaps, maybe this is very misled. Perhaps perceptual evidence and inferential epistemics perhaps could be lumped together as having some form of external anchoring, whereas non-evidentials and purely speculative epistemics could be another group. But I don't know whether that's helpful at all to understand the system. It's more a methodological concern about thinking of different kinds of concepts that you could throw into the mix to see how they realign the system.
Well, thank you for that, because yeah, I started off with something very messy just a couple of years ago and found some parameters that helped me make it a lot more elegant. And maybe there are other parameters that would provide a different view of it. But I actually feel pretty satisfied with the way these two indexical parameters intersect to define the three categories, that they existed before, right? I knew these categories, I knew these distinctions were there before, I just couldn't account for them. And so when I hit on this binary indexical parameter, then it fell into place. So, but maybe there's a different way for things to fall into place.
It seems very convincing to me anyway. I'm just having a thought experiment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a good thought experiment. Always good to embark on those.
And that'll have to be our last question for Nancy Caplow. Thank you again for your talk.
Okay.
And we'll move to the next speaker, who will be David Bradley, who will be giving a presentation on modality in Lisu.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, JC.
Mm-hmm.